Listen, lean in. In the first 8 seconds, I will tell you a truth most men never want to hear. A man can buy a body, but he cannot buy what that body remembers. Keep that sentence with you like a blade. Let it open the skin of whatever comfortable story you tell yourself about civilization, about honor, about who is permitted mercy and who is denied it. This is how the trap begins. Spring in Colleton County smelled like wet iron and roasted sap, the kind of heat that presses secrets into wood until they bleed. Cypress Grove looked like every plantation portrait you've seen. A wide porch, railings chalked white, live oaks draped in hanging moss that moves like slow, green smoke. But look closer. The sheen of wealth was fragile. Underneath it, the men who owned land and law practiced a different devotion. Ritual cruelty dressed as custom, and ceremonies that stitched power to violence. Silas Rutland wanted entry into the inner rooms of the county, the rooms where judges toasted one another, where trustees arranged marriages, where names opened doors. He wanted more than wealth. He wanted the clean, unchallengeable authority that elevates the comfortable to the untouchable. In a place where reputation was currency, debt was a wound that could be picked until it bled you out. So when a circle of men, a private brotherhood, whose symbol was a sickle crossed with a sheaf of wheat, said they could erase the debt, Silas signed a paper that made him less a man than a calculation. You have to understand the world he moved in, a society that rehearsed hierarchy until it was indistinguishable from nature. In their stories, the order of things was ordained. The white owner, the white family, and beneath them the work, the property, the silence. The sanctity of the white household was the most enforced fiction of all. To break it, even slightly, was to invite a kind of social death worse than poverty. So when the brethren offered absolution at the price of humiliation, Silas accepted. He believed humiliation could be contained, that shame could be performed and then hidden. Again beneath the polite smiles of county gatherings, he was wrong. Catherine Rutland was not the pretty, protected daughter that polite gossip imagined. She was a woman whose body had been medicated, dosed, and muted into the category of madness, a social diagnosis that did the work of both concealment and control. Men with influence preferred their inconvenient daughters quiet. Doctors put labels on women like surgical drapes. Labels hide where eyes do not want to see. Catherine's weight, her seizures, her fits, they all fit the story the house wanted. The broken, harmless woman who could be locked in a room and smoothed like a bruise with opiates and mercury tinctures. This story, however, had a fracture. When she was 12, she had seen something behind the cellar door. She had watched men who should have been pillars step down into a dark to perform rites that smelled of old Europe and older things borrowed from the enslaved peoples who worked the fields. Names were called, sacrifices were promised. A bargain was whispered that made the soil richer and the men richer with it. That memory should have been sold to her as imagination, as hysteria. Instead, she carried it like a compass no one could read but she could not forget. That memory, the knowledge that the men who kept the law were nightly worshippers of a darker order, planted a seed of danger in her. She could, if she had strength, speak. She could, if the world was kinder, be believed. But the world was not kinder. It made her a spectacle. The brethren who approached Silas did not ask for his fields. They asked for proof. Proof he understood the doctrine of their survival, that the family, the white line, might be sacrificed for the continuity of the circle. A demonstration was needed. They presented a solution that was both surgical and theatrical. Place your daughter under the total authority of an enslaved man for a year. Announce it as medical desperation. Let the county judge you, pity you, and other men nod in the glow of your conscientious cruelty. In return, debt forgiven, influence returned, silence purchased. Think of that for a second. The ritual required more than bribery. It required a staged inversion to remind the public of the plantation's true hierarchy. It would prove the men had a power beyond law. They could name the unnameable and force the world to swallow it. Humiliation was a ritual. Humiliation was a price the brethren were teaching you to pay to protect the order. You claimed to honor. Enter Ezekiel Cross. He arrived not with braggadocio, but with a steady, unreadable gaze, the kind that unnerves men who expect civility. He had been chosen and placed, a decision made by hands that traded in lives like ledger entries. But he was also a man who had been a husband, a father, cut by the marketplace where Silas once sold his family away. Ezekiel carried names in a child's handwriting folded into cloth. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, names that were a wound in him. Such wounds do not heal by law. They calcify into patient, slow designs. They told him the job was to care for Catherine. They told him that failure meant punishment. They told him to obey. He nodded, because that is how a living plan begins, with a small, compliant sound. Then, without witnesses, he wrapped the names up and looked at the rafters until the shape of his purpose could be drawn. You can imagine him there, pressed up against a life he was bred to accept, planning a reversal that required him to be a certain kind of animal for long, enough to become something else entirely. On his first night, the room they gave him smelled like mercury and shut windows. He met Catherine and saw in her the flash of two things at once: a woman made vulnerable by poison and a mind that retained a razor edge of outrage. She accused. She spat accusations like a mirage of rage. You are not from here. Do you know what they do in the cellar? She spoke of the cellar as though it had a pulse. He told her nothing of the brethren at first. He let her speak. The first tool Ezekiel used was listening. Listening in these houses is a form of violence. You learn where the bones are buried and keep that knowledge, like a weapon. He did not start with revenge. He started with recovery. He eased her off medicines, replacing them with herbs that would make detox painful but real. He walked her through small, humiliating movements. The first steps down a hallway. The first meal without the heavy pastries. The first time she breathed air that was not medicated into resignation. She was angry. She was lucid. She was dangerous. And crucially for him, she remembered. Her memory stitched together nights, names, the list of men who came to the cellar. She had kept a journal, hidden with childish cunning, dates, visits, a catalogue of footsteps on nights when her father was absent and the brethren convened. This is where we must adjust the lens you use to look at justice. You were taught to think of justice as an event, a court, a verdict, a punishment. But there are other forms of justice men practice in the edges of law. Ezekiel's plan was not a courtroom drama. It would be surgical. It would use the tools of social spectacle, the rituals of the brethren against themselves. He sought to return power by rebuilding the only thing that could speak against the brethren with authority. A daughter restored to sanity who could name them and survive to tell it. That survival would be the shattering instrument. You could call it revenge, and it would be. But it would also be strategy. Justice in the shadows is often cruel because it borrows the same methods as the men it opposes. The difference is intention. Now imagine the moment he opened the curtains and let sunlight slice through Catherine's darkened room. A simple gesture, light, became an act of rebellion. It connected her to what she had been before the opiates, before the medicated fog. Imagine being shown a world you had been taught to doubt was real. Imagine being handed back the ability to name your suffering. This is a dangerous gift. Men who arrange silence do not tolerate gifts that create speech. You must understand the moral architecture here. There are men in that society who had equated power with the right to erase anyone who threatened their illusions. There are men who carved the world into pieces that could be traded. Wives, sons, daughters, entire families sold like produce. And there are those who, when pressed, will trade the most intimate things to save face. Silas traded his daughter's autonomy for his reputation. He believed that identity is a ledger where only losses matter. He did not understand that some losses carry unforeseen consequences. The one he declared expendable had a mind with teeth. Over the next days, as Catherine's lucidity returned, she and Ezekiel formed a pact that was not sentimental. It was cold, precise, and inevitable. "When this is done," she said, "I want to die." She wanted it not out of weakness, but because she had seen the depth of the rot and understood that living with knowledge could be worse than the annihilation of truth. She had already killed, she believed, 3 house slaves who might have told. Whether true or not, whether memory was worn around edges, did not matter. What mattered was the consolidation of will. Ezekiel wanted to orchestrate suffering for Silas. Catherine wanted to invert the story so deeply that the brethren would be forced into daylight, to wills welded by the furnace of shared wrongs. Here is where men like you must pay attention. The world we live in honors certain narratives, law, civility, due process. But there is also a parallel law, a subterranean ledger, where power binds men to silence through ritual humiliation, through staged confessions, through the calculated performance of the acceptable, Good, you stayed. That proves something. Curiosity is a kind of courage, and the men who survive the dark learn to let their curiosity be cold and relentless. Now lean closer. We are going deeper into the places a respectable man pretends do not exist. The cellar beneath Cypress Grove is where civility becomes confession and the language of men is recast into blood. Picture the stairs, low, steep, the kind that forces a man to bow. The air down there tastes like old wine and wet earth, the kind of smell that holds memory and hides it. There are tools on a pegboard, not the honest tools of a carpenter, but objects rearranged for ritual, blackened bowls, iron hooks, cloths stained with a history no local sermon ever mentioned. On the lowest shelf, beneath a cracked jar of pickled roots, there is a ledger. Not the ledger you imagine. This one is not about crops or debts. This ledger lists names, dates, favors owed, the small accounts that make empires of influence. It is the map of the brethren's economy, loyalty traded for silence, ritual traded for land. Their god is continuity, their currency, fear. When the brethren convened, they did so with the confidence of men who assume history bends for them. They called themselves stewards of the land, keepers of fertility, guardians of social order. They dressed their actions in myth, old European rites mixed with stolen fragments of the spiritual systems of the enslaved, misread and weaponized. They believed power required offerings. They believed the earth and their fortunes could be coaxed by ceremonial blood. This was not superstition in the harmless sense. It was ideology. It gave moral cover to brutal systems. It taught men that to secure what they desired, to keep titles and courts and marriages intact, some lives would be designated as instruments. The rituals were theatre and accounting in one, spectacle to bind the participants and a ledger to bind the community. The Brethren's meetings were always the same choreography of dominance. Men with white neckerchiefs placed carefully, boots polished as if to reflect the candlelight. They recited oaths in a language that felt familiar because it borrowed the cadence of law but rearranged the verbs. The rites asked for obedience, required sacrifice, and guaranteed that no one outside the circle could speak what was said inside. Silence was not merely asked. It was enforced by ritualized humiliation. The public and the private were inverted. The public world pretended innocence, while power was privately carved out below stairs, and yet rituals, no matter how practiced, are brittle. They are a machine with gears that must align precisely. Greed loosens bolts. Pride misreads omens. A single unaccounted for variable, a woman recovering the ability to speak, a man who remembers names, can introduce friction that will grind the mechanism down to ruin. Ezekiel's plan unfolded inside that friction. He needed not to burn down the Brethren in a single blaze, but to pry open the seams, to force the circle to reveal its structure in a way the law could not ignore. To do that, he and Catherine would manufacture contradictions the Brethren could not explain away. First, they needed credibility. People who sit in the chairs of power dismiss the inconvenient as madness. That was why Catherine's recovery was so central. She had to become, in the eyes of neighbors and ministers, the same woman she had been before the drugs, not polished or reformed, but lucid, articulate, a witness. The more she could demonstrate reason, the harder it would be to call her a hysteric. The ritual required a witness with currency, a white woman, once discounted, who could name the men who walked into that cellar and name what they did. Second, Ezekiel needed to manipulate the sociological arithmetic the Brethren relied upon: reputation, fear, and reciprocity. The Brethren assumed that no one would risk naming them because the consequences were swift and anonymous. Bank accounts closed, marriages ended, reputations shredded. But every economy has a weak point. Ezekiel planned to exploit social reciprocity in reverse. He would show what would happen if the currency of silence was devalued. If one voice could name the ritual and survive, others could follow. The Brethren's leverage depended on the belief that exposure always ended the exposer. Ezekiel intended to change that belief. So the work began in small acts that looked like cruelty and end up being surgical. Ezekiel moved through the house like a shadow that touched only what needed touching. He did not shout or threaten. He adjusted a cup of tea, replaced a tincture, folded a letter where a man's confession might be tucked away. He listened to servants' gossip and took notes the way a ledger keeper takes inventory. He built a network of small truths that, when stitched together, would be undeniable. This is the anatomy of covert strategy. You plant credibility. Then you erode the enemy's assumptions. You push at the seams with the weight of evidence until the machinery designed to preserve silence begins to leak. The Brethren were confident they could contain any leak. Their rituals had held for decades. They had protected land and titles and marriages. They had normalized horror. But confidence breeds predictability, and predictability can be weaponized. One night, a meeting was called in the cellar. A newcomer had been admitted by indulgence, a man with debts to pay and a willingness to please in public. The brethren demonstrated a ritual meant to consolidate loyalty, symbolic offerings, a recitation of lineage, a vow to protect the harvest by any means required. They drank from a cup that smelled of root and iron. Names were called. Favors owed were in. The newcomer entered visibly moved, drunk not from alcohol but from the intoxicating perfume of belonging. What the newcomer did not know was that Ezekiel had arranged for the ledger to be a small, clumsy mistake. A ledger placed beneath a pile of tobacco instead of behind the jar of pickled roots created a trail. Judith, a house slave who still carried curiosity in her old eyes, found the misfiled papers one afternoon when the sun came at a particular angle and exposed a seam in the shelf dust. She did not understand the significance, but she saw handwriting, names, dates, rewards. She tucked the ledger under her apron and kept walking. Because survival is the first interpreter of meaning in places where knowledge can kill. Ezekiel watched this happen from a distance he could make respectable. He did not orchestrate Judith's discovery, not directly, but he had set the shelf the night before, shifting the jars under a pretext. He was learning to shape accidents into opportunities. This is how asymmetry works in the hands of the patient. You do not need to control outcomes. You nudge probability. When Judith took the ledger to Catherine, because Catherine was the only person who would ever listen to her without a servant's pity, the chain began. Catherine, lucid and hungry for retribution, recognized not simply names but patterns, dates that coincided with nights she could not remember, with visits Silas made or with men who were always courteous in the daytime. She read and reread, fingers tracing the ink like a military commander plotting a campaign. Each name was a knot in the net Ezekiel and she intended to pull at this point. The brethren had no idea the net was being woven. Their confidence was their blind spot. They thought secrecy was a garment they had sewn too tightly to ever be ripped. They were wrong because secrecy has seams, and seams can be found. A man who sold a family might be arrogant enough to think he could buy any silence he needed. The problem with arrogance is it is loud. It leaves traces. Ezekiel's careful observation turned arrogance's noise into a breadcrumb trail. This stage of the plan required discipline. Catherine had to produce a controlled revelation, not a public denunciation that could be dismissed as hysteria, but smaller, more precise exposures designed to force the brethren to respond, to expose their mechanisms of damage-making. The idea was cruelly elegant, provoked the machine to show its teeth and then photograph, those teeth with testimony that could not be swallowed. The brethren always operated under a script. If you could force them to deviate, you could expose the manual when a minor. Scandal was manufactured, a misplaced letter revealing a promise of money to a local magistrate. For an easily explained favor, the brethren convened in fear. For the first time in years, they moved in hush, assuming this was an isolated leak easily sealed. But the shift had already occurred. The ledger, once revealed, had created a credibility bridge. Men who had been protected by mutual complicity on the web of favors now had to ask themselves the unbearable question: what if the web was unraveling faster than they could mend it? I want you to picture the faces in that cellar the first time doubt crept into their private language. Men who had never imagined themselves vulnerable suddenly calculated consequences. Pride became arithmetic. They counted allies, whispered contingency plans, and swore oaths that felt suddenly smaller than the danger they were meant to protect against. This is the pivotal moment for any corrupt system, the moment it realizes its rules may not hold. Systems built on secrecy do not fail because the people are immoral. They fail because the mechanism of secrecy requires perpetual enforcement, and enforcement depends on belief. Doubt corrodes belief. Ezekiel knew he needed more than doubt. He needed contradiction. He needed to force the brethren into inconsistent responses that would not simply be contained, but would be visible to the public and impossible for respectable men to explain away. This is when the plan grew colder and more dangerous. The plan grew colder and more dangerous. After that ledger surfaced, the brethren convened in a panic that felt like ritual but smelled of fear. Imagine them in a room thick with tobacco smoke, not the old swagger but a new, cold calculation. They spoke of contingencies as if negotiating a war plan. Judges called in favors. Ministers softened sermons into council meetings. Men who had never been direct with blood now spoke with numbers. They counted potential witnesses, their influence, the place's reputations could be broken and rebuilt. It is important to understand how they thought, not as men confronted with wrongdoing, but as shareholders facing a hostile takeover. Their metric was not morality, it was exposure risk. Ezekiel and Catherine had expected this. They had planned for it. Theirs was not a spontaneous uprising, but a deliberate unmaking. They moved like surgeons around a wound, precise and patient. The ledger had been a wedge. Now they needed pressure. The brethren would respond with a predictable form of mercy, a public petition that framed the ledger's existence as a misunderstanding, then a private campaign to discredit the woman who had the power to speak. This is always the first move. Cast doubt on the witness. If they can make her seem unstable, the ledger becomes dust. Everyone who followed her voice will go quiet again. But there was a problem. The brethren had not accounted for. The ledger was not the only piece of evidence. There were patterns, small consistencies pulled from the memories Catherine had recovered and the things Ezekiel had found in the shadows of that house. They had dates that lined up with the men's official absences, names that appeared in receipts and private ledgers, physical artifacts that could not be explained away with claims of coincidence. They had, crucially, the human factor. Servants who saw the same comings and goings and had, often out of fear, kept their silence. Fear is a currency sometimes more valuable than silver, and Ezekiel intended to devalue it. He began by neutralizing the immediate instruments of the brethren's influence, not by violence at first, but by subtle means that would reveal dependency and complicity. He found a clerk at the county office who kept records for the brethren's businesses. The clerk's children were sick. Ezekiel, with a humility that masked intent, offered help via a remedy for a fever, a tincture, and instructions his grandmother had taught him. The clerk accepted, grateful and blind to the way a small favor would later tilt decisions. This was how influence changed hands, not by dramatic confrontations, but by small, humane gestures that rewired loyalties. The clerk began, without knowing it, to look at ledgers and receipts with a new attention. He was not brave. He was indebted to Ezekiel, not the brethren. You need to see the symmetry here. The brethren assumed loyalty could only be bought with fear, or favors among themselves. They did not expect that a man they had bought and broken could buy back influence with kindness and precision. This inversion is the kernel of what follows. The men in the circle had catalogued persons as assets. They forgot that assets could shift allegiances when the ledger of human favors changed its balance. As Catherine regained strength, she started to attend local affairs in the narrowest, safest way possible. Walks past the garden, brief greetings at the porch, then a carefully staged incident, a disagreement over a donation to a local pew that escalated into a recognizable social slight. The brethren, sensing the emergent pattern of visibility, tried to manage the optics. They sent a respected matron to petition Silas in private, to assure him the community would understand if he quietly contained the matter. But this was the moment Silas felt good. He believed himself to be the captain of his own fate. Silas, desperate for redemption and to reclaim his place among the honored, agreed to a demonstration of contrition that he assumed would be contained, a public act of humility that would smooth the wound. This was the bait. The brethren, confident of control, orchestrated a meeting, a charity event, a visible moment of family healing, to be reported politely in the county paper. They assumed a spectacle of contrition would reset the narrative. What they did not account for was the way spectacle can be hijacked by truth. Ezekiel and Catherine had rehearsed responses, had trained servants to be places where small facts could leak in unremarkable ways. When the event took place, a woman who had been a house servant for decades slipped into the crowd and let drop a casual remark about the cellar, not framed as accusation but as gossip. In the language of those times, gossip was not proof. But in that room, the whisper was a seed. Panic flared in the brethren because their confidence was structured on silence. They moved to smother the whisper with reputation maintenance. Lawyers drafted statements, ministers called for calm, and a man of influence offered a check to the woman's family. This was the reflex of a system. By distraction, create a narrative of normalcy. But you should know, systems that rely on secrecy are brittle not because of courage, but because they cannot explain their actions without revealing their methods. Every lie must be supported by another lie, and the web grows heavy. Ezekiel saw their fear turn visible and used it. He began to create smaller, more personal exposures, letters left in predictable places. A servant handed a folded note meant for a judge that contained a line from the ledger. A receipt left in a coat pocket that mentioned an obscure ritual expense. None of these were dramatic on their own. Taken together, they shifted the probability that someone would speak. A neighbor who had been friendly with one of the brethren now had a sliver of doubt and a sliver of moral gravity. People do not always leap into courage because of righteous fervor. Sometimes they step because the cost of silence becomes more obvious than the risk of speaking at the same time. The brethren responded with calibrated violence, not public violence that would be too obvious, but threats and economic pressure. Land offers were rescinded, marriages were coldly discouraged, and men were advised to cut associations. This is how institutions enforce obedience, through the slow drip of deprivation. A man who thinks of himself as a pillar finds his pillars quietly removed. Ezekiel did not meet force with force. He met it with strategy. He constructed counterpressures that made the cost of compliance to the brethren greater than the cost of reputation. There is a psychological architecture to this phase that you must not miss. The brethren's identity was anchored in the narrative that they were the caretakers of tradition and order. When a woman with a history of being written off as mad began to tell a different story with corroborating artifacts, the religion of their identity started to crumble. Their rituals that once provided moral cover now looked like administrative protocols designed to scaffold extraction. When institutions cliff into cognitive dissonance, they make the worst possible decisions, They lash out, they double down, and they create spectacles of authority that mimic strength but only reveal their internal fractures. Ezekiel understood this better than anyone. He exploited the brethren's need to appear unassailable. He fed them contradictions disguised as concessions. A carefully leaked letter would urge a public act of charity, while an encrypted entry in a ledger exposed a private expense that undercut the charity's sincerity. The more they performed, the more evidence accumulated that their performances were hollow. The social cameras, gossip, letters, receipts were small, but they were numerous. And 1,000 small lights can burn through a cloak dot. As the winter approached, the pressure multiplied. The brethren tried to convene a tribunal of sorts, an internal council meant to adjudicate their honor. They wanted to control the narrative by creating an internal verdict to be publicly announced. It was an old trick: officiate your own cleansing and call it justice. They assumed the public would accept their word because fathers and judges and ministers all bore the same kind of social weight. This was their hubris. What they did not see was how fragile their own moral fabric had become before they called the tribunal. Men who once thought in unison now found private doubts. When the tribunal sat, the format was performative, an audience of friends, a liturgy of defense. But the content leaked. Men who felt the heat of exposure started to trade accusations in whispers. The tribunal was meant to be a wall that concealed the hole in the dam. Instead, it became a place where water started to find new exits. The very performative rituals that had once bound them together became the stage for their unraveling. Their language of secrecy, once in armor, turned into a script that betrayed them. Ezekiel watched the tribunal and let it perform itself. He did not need to shout. He let the sound of their confusion do his work. The men left more disoriented than united. This is the power of a successful strategy against an institution. You do not need to annihilate the body. You need to complicate its rhythms until it can no longer coordinate. Now, understand this. The next step is ugly because escalation is a structural necessity in corrupt systems. When persuasion fails and humiliation is ineffective, institutions gravitate toward more severe measures. The brethren had already shown they were willing to trade a daughter's dignity for their continuity. Their next instinct would be an attempt at decisive, covert annihilation of the threat. This is what institutions do when they fear exposure. They escalate to irreversible acts. The choices they make when fear grips them are the true revealing moments of character and now we descend further into the darkness where choices no one wants to make take shape. This is where morality becomes a luxury, and the true measure of power is whether you can act while others tremble in hesitation. The brethren, already shaken by the ledger and the whispers, began to understand that the threat was no longer abstract. It was tangible, intimate, and dangerous. A presence that moved through their carefully constructed world like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Catherine and Ezekiel had begun to map the interior of the house, the rooms, the servants' routines, the hidden passages and exits. Every creak of floorboard, every draft through a window, every delivery of food became a note in their mental ledger. They were constructing a network of control within the very walls that had once confined them. The plantation was a machine of oppression. They were learning its levers, its blind spots, its rhythms. What you must understand is this: a system designed to subjugate can also reveal its vulnerabilities if observed with patience and precision. Silas, oblivious to the web being woven under his nose, continued to perform his public display of concern, believing that a daughter he had humiliated and a servant he had underestimated could never outmaneuver a lifetime of status and privilege. But power built on fear and secrecy is inherently fragile. The more absolute it seems, the more brittle it is beneath the surface. Every small deviation, a servant hesitant, a ledger incorrectly filed, a whisper becomes a fault line ready to fracture the foundation. Ezekiel's method was surgical. He did not confront the brethren hidden. He introduced chaos into their routines, while maintaining the illusion of compliance. A misdirected letter, a misfiled record, a misheard instruction, all subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but each one widening cracks in their system. And while the brethren scrambled to reassert control, Catherine's transformation became increasingly visible. Her body, once weighed down by manipulation and poison, began to reclaim itself. Strength returned to her limbs, clarity to her mind. Every step she took, every word she spoke, became a demonstration that control could be wrested from the very men who thought it absolute at this point. The psychological stakes intensified. The brethren, sensing something amiss, began to interrogate their own networks. Allies became liabilities. Friends became suspicious. Trust, once taken for granted, dissolved under the pressure of uncertainty. This is the anatomy of systemic fear. It spreads not through direct attack, but through uncertainty, suspicion, and the realization that control was never as absolute as believed. Ezekiel and Catherine had weaponized subtlety, timing, and observation, turning the brethren's own structures against them. And yet, the deeper truth, the forbidden knowledge that transforms a man once he sees it, is not in the tactics alone. It is in the way the human psyche responds when confronted with deliberate, methodical exposure of hidden corruption. The brethren had convinced themselves that fear, hierarchy, and secrecy would shield them. They had not counted on insight, endurance, and the unrelenting patience of someone who has nothing left to lose except injustice. The ledger, the whispered observations, the precise interventions, all of it became an invisible web tightening around them, and they did not realize they were caught until it was too late, by now. Catherine's recovery was more than physical. It was psychological. Every revelation shared between her and Ezekiel chipped away at the constructed reality her father and his peers had imposed. She learned not just to walk and speak, but to anticipate, to manipulate social currents, to wield the subtle forces that governed human behavior. Knowledge, in this context, was more lethal than any blade. It could reshape minds, break systems, and turn the strongest men into frightened actors in a play whose script they no longer controlled. And then came the first, public confrontation, a small gathering where the brethren attempted to assert dominance, to reassure the community that nothing had changed. Ezekiel had prepared for this moment. The placement of allies, the timing of disclosures, the strategically leaked observations, everything was aligned. As the event unfolded, subtle acts of defiance became visible. A servant's knowing glance, a ledger misplaced, a whispered correction of a lie. The brethren, trained to expect obedience, misread these signals. They assumed normalcy, but every misstep of theirs amplified the perception of weakness. It is here that the psychology becomes critical. Power, when challenged in subtle but relentless ways, begins to panic. The more absolute the control previously seemed, the more destabilized it becomes when the facade cracks. The brethren, in their desperation, began to attempt small manipulations, coercions, and intimidation, all of which were anticipated and neutralized. Each failure to reassert control fed a compounding sense of vulnerability, and every man in the room could feel it, even if no one admitted it aloud. Fear had become contagious, seeping silently into corners of the mind, shaping actions before thought could intervene. At the climax of this section, we reach a point that is essential to understand. Control is never purely physical. It is psychological, relational, and structural. Catherine and Ezekiel did not need to overpower the brethren physically. They needed only to expose inconsistencies, highlight dependencies, and allow the natural consequences of fear and secrecy to play out. The brethren, bound by centuries of inherited strategies of dominance, were ill-equipped to confront a methodical unraveling, executed with precision and patience. Here, I need you to take a moment, mentally place yourself inside this environment. Imagine a house of power, built on fear, secrecy, and privilege, beginning to crumble under subtle, relentless pressure. Imagine the quiet panic in men who believed themselves untouchable. This is the anatomy of institutional decay, and it applies far beyond the plantation, far beyond any single moment in history. Every structure that relies on fear, secrecy, and hierarchy is vulnerable to the exact forces Ezekiel and Catherine applied: knowledge, patience, precision, and the courage to exploit weak points others assume inviolable. And before we proceed deeper into the descent, the point where confrontation becomes unavoidable, where the machinery of corruption begins to eat itself alive, pause and consider your role as an observer. These are not merely stories of the past. They are patterns, templates of control and resistance repeated through time. And now, in the comments below, type the phrase "the air in Cypress Grove had changed." It was no longer merely oppressive with the weight of humidity and expectation. It carried a quiet charge, a sense of inevitability, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the secrets of centuries and now exhaled them in warning. The first public confrontation had been subtle, but its effects rippled through the county's elite like a hidden current. Men who believed themselves untouchable began to feel the cold. Creeping awareness that control was not only slipping but that their very identities were tethered to illusions of dominance. Catherine and Ezekiel had observed carefully, noting not just what was said, but what was unsaid, the hesitation in glances, the tremor in hands, the micro-pauses in speech that revealed far more than open dialogue ever could. Ezekiel had spent the early morning hours mapping the social terrain. Each individual of the brethren had a pattern, a rhythm of behavior, a predictable response to authority, intimidation, and suggestion. Some relied on fear to project control. Others leaned on rationalization, on the manipulation of perception. Each could be destabilized, but only if approached with precision. This is what true strategic power demands, not brute force, but patience, insight, and the willingness to operate within shadows, unobserved and unnoticed until the perfect moment. The first act of direct exposure came on a quiet afternoon. Silas had convened a small council in the drawing room, a mixture of family, allies, and select members of the brethren, to discuss what he considered a minor breach, Catherine's recovery. He underestimated her, as all men of absolute power do when they believe weakness is permanent. She had grown not only stronger, but smarter, her mind honed by years of subtle observation and the careful dismantling of her own fears. She walked into that room not as the daughter of Silas, not as the broken woman whispered about in the corridors, but as a force that carried truth like a weapon, Ezekiel positioned himself carefully near the door, his presence calm, almost unassuming, yet every motion deliberate. Catherine's first words sliced through the room like a blade. She spoke of the treatments she had received, the medicines that had been administered under the guise of care, and the subtle ways in which her body had been controlled and poisoned over years. She named names, described behaviors, referenced incidents that had been recorded in her private journal, and revealed knowledge of rituals and gatherings that were known only to the inner circle. The brethren froze. Shock, disbelief, and panic coursed through them. No one had anticipated that the girl they dismissed as mad could speak with such precision, such authority, and such clarity. But revelation alone was not enough. Catherine and Ezekiel knew that power requires leverage, and leverage is reinforced by perception. The next step was demonstration. One of the elders, a man named Judge Pelham, had been particularly cruel in enforcing the subtle manipulations that kept the household in line. Catherine began with him. She recounted.